All right, so you're just starting a brand new audit and you've never seen any of this code before. You've just opened the code base, so you go to the README. But surprise, surprise, it's the basic auto-generated hard hat README. And there are over a dozen contracts. You don't know exactly where to start, so you just sort of dive in and start meandering around in the code. This is unfortunately not going to cut it for a really quality audit that uncovers as many bugs as possible. So in this video, I'm going to give you a comprehensive breakdown of a repeatable and organized auditing process that's going to allow you to uncover as many bugs and vulnerabilities as possible. Let's get right into it. All right, what's up, my fellow auditors? My name is Owen. About a year ago, I founded Guardian Audits, and since then, we've audited dozens of decentralized exchanges, NFT projects, optimizer vaults. The list goes on, and we found dozens of critical and high vulnerabilities. And what I want to do is distill down the process that we've learned from doing all of these audits and finding as many critical and high vulnerabilities as we possibly can, and basically give it to you so you can use it as a repeatable, organized system to find as many bugs as possible and provide the highest quality audit that you possibly can. So this video, I'm going to break down how to prepare for an audit, how to set up for the most fruitful audit possible, how to then, once you begin the audit, lay the groundwork for as productive of an audit as possible when you first open the code base, digging into the meat of an audit, how to actually really dig in and get a repeatable system that you can continue to use to uncover every single code path that needs to be explored and validate it against all of the possible attack vectors. Then I'm going to explain a little bit about how I use tests and POCs to massively enhance the value of an audit and reinforce my understanding of the protocol. And then finally, we'll go over how to effectively wrap up an audit and then what you should be doing the days and weeks after an audit is finished. And make sure that you go ahead and subscribe and hit the bell, because I'm actually going to be releasing a series of videos of me actually implementing this project as I start to dig in and audit GMX's upcoming synthetics exchange, which has over 10,000 lines of Solidity code. But let's not waste any more time. Let's just jump right in. All right, first and foremost, when you're just preparing for an audit before you've even gotten the code base, the most important thing is going to be just the logistics of the audit. First and foremost, you just need to make sure that you have enough time to be able to cover the whole code base and do your due diligence on every single piece of the code base. Oftentimes, you'll hear a number like 200 Solidity lines of code per hour being thrown around. Personally, I think that this is not the most accurate representation of how fast somebody can actually effectively fully audit code when you're in the context of an audit. I think that this could apply to things like C4 contests, where it's okay if you miss findings, but in an audit, it is really important that you actually flesh it out and find as many bugs and vulnerabilities as possible, right? So in an audit setting, I personally don't believe that the 200 lines of code per hour holds. Personally, I feel like it might be somewhere closer to 100 lines per hour, or perhaps even 50 lines for a part of the protocol that is really central and pivotal to its execution. Next, of course, it probably seems obvious, but you need to make sure that you're going to be well rested for any audit that you perform. You simply cannot have the mental capacity to evaluate code and actually think about every attack vector possible if you're not well rested and you're not on top of your diet and stuff like this. All right, so obviously when you're preparing for an audit, one of the most important things we want to do is research other similar protocols, right? So if you're going to be auditing a DEX, go and look at previous DEX audits and look at all of the common attack vectors. What are the common exploits? What are the incentives? What could go wrong, right? And it's really important that we do all of that before we actually hop into the audit and start spending time looking at the code base, so that we have that context as we're just initially going in, and we can save a ton of time that's actually going to be useful for evaluating real code paths in the code base and coming up with new bespoke attack vectors that are actually non-trivial and interesting to the protocol. All right, the next part that is really just essential to providing the highest quality audit possible is going to be figuring out how are you going to communicate with others that you're working with, who are you going to work with, how many people are you going to work with, and that all needs to be handled before we start the audit, right? I have always found that working with at least one other person on a code base is going to provide a tenfold increase in the quality of the findings that you're able to come up with. You'll find that when you work with somebody else, you're able to sort of combine your mental models of the code base and come up with insanely better, more creative, bespoke attack vectors that could be levied on the code base. Right. And these are things that you might not have time to come up with and sort of ideate about if you're not able to work with others and just combine your context and move through the code base a lot more rapidly. Last but certainly not least is going to be the tooling that you have, right? So this is stuff like the editor that you use, a document that you have that you're going to share with everybody else that you're working on the audit with, or a test suite repo that you're just going to make pull requests to and basically build up a bank of all the tests and POCs that you do throughout the audit. So firstly, I'll just touch on the code editor. Obviously, you're going to want something that you have experience with, something that you're comfortable with. But above all, it is so important that you're able to basically just click around and navigate the code base really easily. Because as you're looking at these things, you really want to be able to just click around and look into this, be like, oh, what is this? And then click there and immediately you're there. You don't want to have to put in all of this extra mental overhead to ask yourself, oh, what file is that contract in? Go click on that and then Command F search through that file. No, you want to have something that's indexed to the code so that you can just literally command click or whatever it might be and literally jump there so that you can immediately just continue your current thread of, your mental train of thought. Cool. So now we have begun the audit. You've got the code base and you want to start diving in. So as opposed to just sort of meandering around, if there's no README, obviously you want to go to the README first. But other than that, if there's no helpful README, more often than not, it's going to be just a generated hard hat README. You want to first scan the code base for any big block comments that you see, anything that might give you some context or gotchas on the code, and just make sure you at least just glaze over those. You probably don't need to go through all of them exactly line by line just yet, as a lot of them are going to be more context specific to the code that is within that file. But it's good to scan and see if there's anything with some more global comments. Next, to really start to be able to dig into the audit, you're going to want to leverage the research that you've already done when you were preparing for the audit and enumerate the jobs to be done for the audit. So what do I mean by this? What you want to do is enumerate all of the things that a user is supposed to be able to do as a result of this system being deployed, right? So in the example of a simple DEX, a user is just going to be able to swap tokens, right? They might be able to swap from 2 tokens directly, or they might be able to provide a path and swap from one token that doesn't necessarily have liquidity with this other token and follow a path of tokens to be able to make that swap. A user might also be able to provide liquidity and collect fees on their liquidity that they've provided. These are both overarching jobs to be done of the system, right? So we want to sort of just list those out and then try to find where these interactions that the user is going to start making happen in the code, right? So if there's some router contract for this exchange, we're going to want to go to the router, right? And start checking out the external and public functions that the user is able to interact. And then from there, what we're going to do is we're going to take just a very high level approach and we're going to start just clicking through the code and being able to basically evaluate, okay, what is the sort of path that a user's transaction follows as we go through the code base. And as you're taking this sort of exposition into the code base, do not read line by line or try to by any means memorize the code. Just sort of think about what each function's purpose is, generally how is storage being manipulated at a very high level to make this thing actually happen. And if there's multiple contracts, how is each contract interacting with each other to be able to achieve this? Now, as you're doing this initial read through, remember we'll have a really high level approach to this. But of course, you're going to have things that you see, and it might be like, oh, is this function, like, can I re-enter into this function? Or you might see some like small gas optimization that could be made. Make sure that as you're doing this high look through the code base, that you don't get sort of snagged on these different sort of threads that you could go down. Instead, go ahead and make a audit tag in the code and sort of just mark your comments or your thoughts at this point. If that might be like a edge case that you thought thought of, or like a question of why. It might even be just like, why is this like this? Just initial thoughts that you're having as you're reading through the code. Just make that comment there and then continue along the sort of mental train of thought that you're already on, so that you don't get distracted and you're able to actually accomplish something instead of sort of just getting pulled in 7 different directions and not actually ending up cutting through the code base and getting to what you want. A few other things that I like to personally do when I first open a code base is going to be stuff like running the test suite just to see what is the overall coverage that we're working with here. What's the state of the test suite? Are all the tests passing or some of them failing? This is going to give you a great sense of what is the general code quality, right? And if you're running something like a coverage checker, you're going to also see what are some of the blind spots in the test suite, right? And then maybe note that down somewhere, and later on we might want to actually go ahead and check these blind spots and give a closer eye to them, and maybe even fill in the test suite for them so that we can catch out any bugs that might be caught more easily by a compiler. And then one last thing that I like to do sometimes is generate a call graph. This can be done with common tools like Surya. As you can see here, here's just a general high-level call graph of what would otherwise be a very complex system, but we can now break it down and sort of build a mental model of how the contracts are actually working here. All right, so let's talk about really diving in and getting into the meat of the audit. You've covered the beginning of just gaining general context on the jobs to be done, and you probably already have a decent amount of audit tags scattered throughout the code base as you've done your general walkthroughs at this point, right? So now as we start digging in, we're going to start going back to those audit tags and pulling on those threads. Maybe you had just edge cases that you had listed out, and now you want to actually take the time to start to go through these particular pieces of the code with these edge cases, comments, questions in mind, and start reading on a little bit of a more fine-grained level, right? So before we were just looking for high-level understanding of the functions and how the contracts were interacting with each other. Now we want to be going more line by line and understanding what each line is doing and starting to pay attention to more granular stuff. For example, I think probably most of the most common critical vulnerabilities stem from literally just typos in the code, where it just takes that fine-grained attention to detail. So that's the level of detail that we're going to be paying attention to as we start pulling on these audit tags that we've made. And remember, as you're going through each of these audit tags, stick to the thread that you're on, right? So if you notice another like attack vector that could happen, like, oh, could this yield like a gas griefing attack vector, something like this, throw that in the code as an audit tag and just put it in the backlog, right? Don't get distracted and start to get pulled in 7 different directions. That way you'll never actually be able to make any progress on this code base, right? So finish your tags and then go and investigate the other ones that you noticed along the way. Cool. So after you've pulled on a lot of your initial threads and resolved all of those audit tags, maybe you ended up adding more audit tags and then you ended up resolving those. Now you have a lot of context on the protocol that you didn't have before, right? You might find yourself in a place where you're out of leads, right? You don't have any more threads to pull on, no more audit tags left in the code to go over, right? So if you ever run out of leads for possible vulnerabilities or things to examine, here's a nice little exercise that I sort of developed to sort of get me kickstarted and to find new interesting things to look into that are often going to be fruitful and yield some interesting high-level vulnerabilities. So first of all, with all this new context that we've gained on the protocol, let's go ahead and just enumerate all of the little knobs that an attacker has over the protocol, right? What storage can they manipulate? And just sort of list all of the different things that an attacker could do. And a lot of these things might even be audit tags that you realize along the way. Like if you see that an attacker can do an interesting thing, like perhaps prevent somebody from transferring an NFT by perhaps like adding some sort of specific callback contract or something like this. Note that in the code and add it to a list, a running list that you have of the different knobs that an attacker has at their disposal. So even just having this list is going to enable you to start thinking about all sorts of different exploits that you can use. Again, like even combining the different knobs on this list might yield some interesting bespoke attack vector that would only apply to this particular protocol. protocol. The knobs on this list are really like your Legos, your building blocks for making really interesting and creative exploits. But what we're going to do is actually combine this list with divergent thinking to come up with an exact sort of enumerated list of ways that we could break the protocol. So throughout your high-level overview, you definitely encountered some invariants in the code that ought to hold inter-transaction with the protocol. Stuff like if I deposit money into the vault, I should only ever be able to withdraw exactly the money that I put into the vault, or things like this, right? Or if I literally had two transactions that were back-to-back, I should not end up with more money in than I got out, or something like this, right? Okay, so once you have a list of all of these invariants, what we're going to do is use divergent thinking to come up with potential attack vectors that somebody could use to actually invalidate these invariants, right? So usually when you're thinking about invariants, you tend to think about, okay, how can we validate this invariant, right? How can we verify it? And you might use stuff like formal verification, or you might even just manually walk through and say, oh, that looks like that holds, right? But what we want to do is think the opposite. Let's think about how we can break these invariants, right? So we have a list of these invariants. Why don't we sort of just enumerate a list of how they might be broken? And then let's see if any of those ways that the invariant could be broken could be executed by one of those knobs or several of those knobs combined that an attacker has at their disposal. So an example of this, if I wanted to sort of think about how I might break the invariant of putting an amount of tokens into a vault and then immediately taking them out with the in the same block or something like this, and the amount out being different than the amount in, just thinking off of the top of my head, I might think about things like fee on transfer tokens. I might think about the attacker sort of like sandwich attacking somebody in the middle where somebody is depositing into the vault, and then the attacker front runs them and then back runs them and ends up with a different amount of tokens based on that. Or perhaps they're even sandwich attacking some sort of like harvest mechanism for the vault or something like this, right? So I'm basically just enumerating ways that these invariants that I've sort of just come up with could be broken. And then now I combine this with all the knobs that I know that are particular to the protocol. And I can see, oh, is there a way where, I can sort of make this happen? And will it actually affect the protocol, right? So as you can see, when we get into the meat of the audit, it really looks like a continuous process of basically just learning more about the code and then coming up with new, interesting, creative, maybe even bespoke attack vectors, and then actually going back and re-examining the code within that context. And then as you notice things as you go, write down audit tags and sort of section those off and stay focused on the current thread that you're on, and then go back to those audit tags later. And it's sort of a cycle that just gets repeated as you continuously gain more and more context on the code until you have really, really sufficiently explored all the possible code paths, every possible edge case that you could think of. And again, this is only going to get compounded more and more with the other auditors that you collaborate with. And really, just to emphasize, throughout this process, you should be continuously collaborating with the other auditors that you're working on this with. It's really going to quadratically increase the speed at which you're able to cover ground in the audit. And that is just so important when it comes to getting all of the context gaining out of the way, building a really, really strong understanding of the protocol, and really having a robust mental model of how these things work. Because really, once you have a strong mental model of the contracts and the systems, that's when you can step away from the computer, and subconsciously you can just start picking at the contracts, evaluating it against different attack vectors. Maybe you're literally on Twitter and you just read something and you're able to sort of think like, oh yeah, I think that actually might be a problem in this contract or something like this, right? So we really need to get all of that context gaining done and downloaded into your brain as quickly as possible. And then once you've done that, then you really want to bounce all of these ideas off of your fellow auditors. And this way you're able to cover just so much more ground in terms of all of the different types of attack vectors that could be made on the contracts. Okay, so now I want to talk about writing tests and POCs in an audit, right? These are really going to help you mainly do two things, right? So first of all, when you think of a new attack vector, maybe you're not sure if it's a valid attack vector, it's going to allow you to sort of prove that out. And second of all, it's going to give you a lot more of a solid basis for your mental model that you have of the contracts, right? It's going to show you that, yes, this is indeed how the contracts work, or it might tell you exactly where some of your misconceptions of the protocol were, right? So you're going to basically be comparing your mental model of the contracts against what is in reality the truth of how the contracts actually execute. So it is really valuable to actually go ahead and be writing tests and POCs while you're sort of in the meat of the audit. All right, so we have basically gone through the meat of the audit. We've done that continuous process of finding new threads to pull on. We've pulled on all of those threads, and then we've found new ones and pulled on those, and we just continue to do that until the audit has sort of come to an end. So when we're wrapping up the audit, we just want to tie up all these loose ends in the code that we might have, all of these audit tags that are maybe not resolved, ones that you might have put off until the last minute. Just go ahead and go through the code and make sure all of your thoughts are resolved. You get everything down on paper, and make sure that you're able to go into the findings doc and go ahead and work through each of the findings that you've recorded in here and be able to work through your head exactly how this works. And ideally you have a POC for each one, right? So some of these might not be findings that you personally made. You want to be able to understand each and every finding because, one, this is going to increase your understanding of the protocol, but two, we just want to make sure that this is a valid finding, right? So if every auditor individually understands each finding and agrees that it is indeed a vulnerability of the criticality that it's listed at, then we're going to have just a lot better of a quality of a report that doesn't have all of these findings that are, potentially vapor findings, So speaking of the report, the next thing we want to do is just create the report. After we've tied up all the loose ends in the code and we validated all of our findings, then you're going to want to create the report. And in the report, you're going to want to have a couple of important things. This includes obviously a description of each finding, which should be clear but yet concise and give exact line numbers that are relevant to the finding, and potentially even point to a POC that's going to be able to give a lot more context and is hopefully really well commented so that anybody who's just reading over it can easily understand exactly what's happening. And then if there are any doubts, they can literally just run the test and see that it is indeed a vulnerability, right? Another thing that you're going to want to include in the report is a recommendation for a fix, right? So a lot of times, even just including the resolutions is going to add more clarity and more specificity to what exactly the problem is, right? Sometimes, literally just by reading the description, I might not understand exactly what a vulnerability is or what's really the crux of the vulnerability. But sometimes when I read the solution, it's a lot clearer, right? So it's great to include solutions, firstly, just to obviously give a path forward for the team, but also it just gives more context. So they're really great to have. And then after the audit has been finished, the report has been made, and you've delivered the report, the audit is not over. And I want to stress this because you see a lot of audit reports that go out and then potentially the team actually makes changes to the code base after the audit and they end up being exploited based on the changes that they made after the audit, right? So this is what will really set you apart from other auditors, other firms, is if you sort of stick around and validate, first of all, that all the findings that are pointed out in the report were actually resolved, and also make sure that the new additions didn't open up any new vulnerabilities in the code, right? And ideally, you're able to sort of stick around and follow up with the team until they eventually get to the deployed version of the code and make sure that that is one that is close to what the audit prescribed. Great, so that is a comprehensive breakdown of an organized, repeatable system that you can use to deliver really high quality audits and find as many bugs and vulnerabilities as possible, right? So now that you've watched this video, now that you've got this system, I want you to go forth and use it. Go and use it on your next solo audit, use it on your next whatever C4 contest, if that's what it might be. But put this process into use and start to see how it helps you organize all of your thoughts and actually ending up with more findings and vulnerabilities. If you're interested in joining a tight-knit community of like-minded, practicing, and aspiring auditors who talk all things Solidity with daily bug challenges, with groups of auditors for practice audits, and even potentially running shadow audits with myself and some of my co-founders, then check out the Solidity Lab. You can learn more about the Solidity Lab at lab.guardianaudits.com, and we'll have all the information there, and you can fill out an application to join. All right, that's all for this time. I'll see you in the next one.